Hij heeft een bedrijf dat heet Flashback Books. Maar zijn eigenlijke bezigheden zijn al heel lang het in kaart brengen van de psychedelische beweging. We kunnen hem zien als de historian, de historicus van de psychedelische beweging in Amerika. Hij heeft heel nauw samengewerkt met Tim Leary, maar ook met mensen als Hofman, Shugin en andere ontdekkers en experimentatoren en promotors van de psychedelische beweging. Dat is, zoals u misschien weet, dat zijn mensen die denken dat je psychedelische drugs zoals LSD of MDMA zou kunnen gebruiken voor het verder ontdekken van je eigen identiteit, van je eigen zijn. Hulpmiddelen voor bewustzijn dus. En geen drugs in de betekenis zoals we die op straat kennen. Een interview dat plaatsvond in Millvalley op het eiland Tiburon. En dat is vlak ten noorden van San Francisco. Goeiedag. Mijn naam is Luc Sala en dit is Mystère. Een paar jaar geleden, toen Tim Leary nog leefde, kwam ik geregeld bij hem in Los Angeles in zijn huis. En toen zei hij wel eens, je moet kennis maken met Michael Horowitz, want dat is mijn biograaf, de man die alles over mijn leven vastlegt en bewaart. Dat is er nooit van gekomen, maar afgelopen jaar was Michael Horowitz in Amsterdam en daar heb ik hem ontmoet. En we hebben een afspraak gemaakt en nu zit ik in zijn huis in Tiburon. En dat ligt ten noorden van San Francisco. En we gaan praten met deze man die een heel belangrijke rol heeft gespeeld in de psychedelische beweging. Als uitgever, als vastlegger, als archiefbewaarder. Maar omdat iedereen kent, ook een soort sociaal netwerk heeft. Welkom Michael.
Hi.
As you heard, I said I know you because of Tim Leary. He has been a character in your life that had some influence.
Yes, for about 25 years or so. From the time I first got involved with him, it was the year 1970, he was in prison. He had just had bail denied, and he was in prison for a sentence of about 10 years. And Nixon was riding high in the White House, and the 60s were over, and things were kind of looking bleak for Tim. However, he was already thinking about his escape and concerned with his archives. Tim was, first of all, a scientist, a great social scientist, a revolutionary scientist, and
he was actually a professor at Harvard.
That's correct. PhD and a teacher. He devised tests, psychological tests in the 1950s, which were used for the next 20 or 30 years. In fact, were given to him when he was in prison.
Yeah, which actually, in the book Flashback, and your company is now called Flashback. And when you read the book, he says at one time, yes, I used the same test because I knew what I had to answer to get in a minimum security prison.
Absolutely, because he was already thinking of escape. And his escape, of course, was a tremendous shock to the counterculture. Because when does a Harvard professor get imprisoned and then escape from prison? That's part of the legend. Anyway, while he was in prison, he was thinking about his archives, which are something very carefully organized. His correspondence, his scientific research papers, his manuscripts, his letters, his personal memorabilia, and he and his wife wanted someone to look after them. And it so happens that a few people and myself had started a library of drug literature that very year in San Francisco. So we were intellectual hippies, and we were early on. We were part of the 60s psychedelic movement. We had great respect for Tim. We'd not met him yet personally at that point, but we had decided to collect the literature, collect the books, and the ephemera, the buttons, the artifacts and so on of the period. We were probably the first people to think along those lines. And so they heard about us. We were invited to be involved in the crazy lives And we took care of their archives. They were turned over to us just before Tim escaped from prison. And then things got even wilder after that. We visited him in Europe, where he was living in exile, first in Algeria, then in Switzerland. And Amsterdam would have been a great haven, but it was a little too soon. And we got more archives from him. And we were also involved as smuggling manuscripts for him, getting some of his words out, getting information to the underground about what was happening. And then when he was recaptured and brought back, continued to see him in prison and help him in his trials and with his publications.
Yeah, because he was recaptured in Afghanistan. He was flying somewhere, and they got him at the airport.
That's right. He was set up in Afghanistan. He finally wore out his welcome in Switzerland. He said that he was his kind of 86th, which is an American expression for like thrown out for having too good a time in public. He was, it's exile's difficult for anybody, and he did the best he could, and he was welcomed by all the hippies in every country he went to, but it was a period of paranoia and danger, and Nixon was reelected, and he was a thorn in the side of the American government. Nixon actually called him the most dangerous man alive, which really, says something about him. Of course, we all love the fact that he was called the most dangerous man alive. We may even use that on the next book we do about him. But at any rate, I visited him in prison and continued to maintain the archives until the FBI came, took them away, and there was a lot of press about that, and I was the center of attention.
They took the archives away?
Yes, they did. They seized the archives, and it was part of a bargain Tim was making with them to get out of prison. And he knew the archives. There was nothing in there to hurt anybody, but nonetheless, it sent waves of paranoia through the counterculture. And I was called before a grand jury. There was a lot of stuff that went down. It was dangerous and exciting, and it was like part of being involved in the whirlwind of Timothy Leary's life. But then after he got out of prison, and nobody was hurt in the process, he set up in L.A. and started a new life and was very productive as a writer again. And this time, was sort of the center of a social scene in the Hollywood world, and a whole new life started for him there. And Tim used to say there were 24 Timothy Learys. You've probably heard him say this, Luke. He thinks there's 24 Luke Solids and Michael Horowitzes. We're all multi-personalities, and it's okay to go. Don't stay with one. It gets too boring. Life should be more interesting. Try on another persona. And in his case, they were pretty extreme. From the PhD, Harvard clinical psychologist, to the revolutionary research in personality. Then in interaction, he was mostly interested in the way people interacted. I'm sure you could tell. He was fascinated by people, and he never, he had time for everybody.
He was a psychologist at heart.
Yes, he was. He really wanted to know what made people tick, and himself as well. And he had not everything. Not everything worked out. A lot of. He risked a lot and he made mistakes, but I think his legacy is enormous and not the slightest bit realized yet, except by maybe 20 or 30,000 people who read his books, and which I'm happy to see are published in many different languages. And this culminated in a bibliography that I did, came out in 10 years ago. Having had all his archives and made notes on all his writings and publications.
Which was an enormous amount.
Which was enormous. There are 1,200 separate items in this book just in 1986, in about 12 languages represented. This book would be about 25-30% longer if I redid it. And Tim left quite a record, and this also lists things written about him.
What always amazed me about Leary was that there was, he would say 24, but I knew this gentle host, and a real gentle host in his house when he was quiet. Mm-hmm. You would visit and there were no people around. Yes. He was very gentle. He would take care of everything. A very sweet man. And then the other man was the idiot out there on the stage doing his thing.
The shaman.
Well, the shaman, but at the same time a clown sometimes.
Well,
yeah.
He was a stand-up philosopher is the way he liked to put it. Yeah. Well, he was a great entertainer. He learned how to do that because he dealt with the media. And in very difficult situations, because he was really on the edge of something so wild and scary, the psychedelic movement, that And then, of course, he got involved when he escaped from prison, called the most dangerous man alive, and he allied himself with quite a few revolutionary, more radical underground, revolutionary movements that called for the overthrow of America. So he had quite a past. I think he learned how to deal with the media, made mistakes, but learned. And he took it into L.A. and made it a one-man comedy show. And he really delivered on the stage, I thought. And he also made 10 movies, by the way. We shouldn't neglect to mention his death, which was a public event. He invented the phrase "designer death," and it was truly that. And it may be one of the most influential things he ever did. He had, he died in a very public way, using the internet to let people know his health. Also, let people know that the things he took every day to make his life, the quality of his life, better. And everything from coffee to...
Well, let me tell you, Michael, we were there a few weeks before he died, and the number of, this is in the middle of America, but the number of hash cookies and stuff in his fridge was enormous. And he had this and that special stuff. He was using a lot of different kinds, even though
he was using a laughing gas that turned out to be a very effective pain reducer and anxiety reducer for short periods. And he, psychedelics. He was drinking a bit when he wanted to, and smoking when he wanted to. He did what he wanted to. That was his style. But I was once sitting in my house listening to the radio, and the leading news station was giving his recipe for marijuana. Actually, it was a form of the marijuana cookie, and it was on his website. And such was his fame and his identification in people's minds with drugs, that in his last months he was getting out through the major news networks a recipe for marijuana brownies, which of course is a tremendous very illegal, but very much a pain reducer, and people who are in terminal stages benefit greatly from it. And in fact, there was a campaign to legalize medical marijuana, which passed shortly after Tim died. That he was, even as he was dying, he was agitating and doing his part for the things that benefit people.
In the end, they didn't freeze his head or his body.
No, they didn't. There's a myth that they did. There was a movie that suggested that. He considered that option, but he rejected it in the end. He was cremated, actually. He died, and his ashes were launched into space in a bold new commercial thing where anybody could do this for I think it's $5,000. The first 8 people who signed up for this. One was Gene Roddenberry, the inventor of Star Trek, the creator of Star Trek, and Tim. And when Tim heard about this option, he was thrilled. He went through a phase of let's leave the planet, space migration, space colonies. Tim was quite a futurist, and so that's why he considered the option of freezing his body. And
we were there at the time when the lawyers came in, because we had to, they would use him as their token. Frozen body to convince other people to pay the money. So he had to sign this and that and that and that. Right. And there was constant debate with these people. It was like they were trying to sell him the idea. And
he was the most famous, although there's been rumors about Walt Disney and people like that. Tim was their most famous advocate for a while. But I don't exactly know the details, but they broke apart, and Tim...
We felt the tension there. We were there, and I know that John Barlow kind of advised against it, and we advised against it. He said, Tim, you lived a good life, and this has been it, and if there's an afterlife, it will be okay too.
See you there. Yeah. One of the best cartoons I saw after Tim died showed Tim in front of Heaven's Gates, walking away with a downcast look on his face, obviously had been rejected, and there's a sign on the gate, drugs, and a line through it. So... And of course, Tim would not...
Tim Leary, if we're at the end of the century, some people say he was an important figure in the 20th century. Was he? And how important was he?
Yeah, I think he's clearly one of the most important figures of the 20th century. I think in the 21st century, the importance of psychedelic drugs will be, realized in the mainstream by the wide majority of people. It's one of those things which takes more than one generation Unlike a lot of other things, it takes more than a generation for, people this to find an acceptable niche in society, because it does, revolutionize things. Although it's ancient, we know that. But this is the 60s were the first time that, huge numbers of middle-class people, were experimented because of the form of LSD, the way it came, and the cheapness of it, and so on. And the repression against it was enormous. And
why has that movement disappeared? I mean, there must be, even in office now, many of the senators and the people in political office must have taken LSD or at least marijuana or been stoned or whatever. Al Gore admitted to inhale. The president didn't, but most of those people must have taken something. Why? It seems like they've forgotten that the basic lesson there was the reality is what we make of it. Yeah, that it's a function.
There are multiple realities and so on, and then multiple perspectives. Actually, and Tim, this really comes from Albert Einstein. And Tim, just to throw this in before I answer your question, Tim used to say, "I'll be remembered in the 21st century, but probably it'll be some combination of Mick Jagger, Albert Einstein, and Timothy Leary." And then, of course, he was trying to think of a woman, that he could add to that mix. And he's probably right. Was it Einstein who discovered LSD, or would Hoffman sing with the Rolling Stones, or was Tim Leary? I mean, that's what happens. Getting back to your question, it's the repression against the psychedelic movement was so strong that it just, forced everybody to just take a step back and say, okay, as long as I want my private life. It's like we'll just sort of build a society, but it also, the times changed, and it wasn't possible, certainly by the time Reagan came into office, to live like hippies. It became more difficult to live like we did in the 60s, sharing things and living on nothing and so on. Although some people managed to do it,
But very few. Most became normal citizens.
Also, a lot of us wanted to change things by getting involved in professional work, including the media, and have an influence that way. I started. The library. I went as far as I could with the local library. With a few other people, I built the world's largest library of books about drugs. And that we thought we would be established by 1980 and part of the Smithsonian Institute and a Great World Library. But in fact, there was no support whatsoever. We couldn't raise any money. And we published, there started to be a lot of books about psychedelics. We were involved in publishing some of them. They didn't sell very well. We finally had to put the library in storage, and that's when I started a book-selling business, which I still run to this day, called Flashback Books. And I sell books on drug history, drug use, drug behavior, all languages, all periods, and also the 60s counterculture. There's definitely become a genre of book collecting, but and now Hollywood is. Tim sold the rights to his life story, but it's taken 4 years, and the film is still in, development. It's in turnaround at the moment, so it takes a long time. And this must be the reason for this must be that what happened was so far out that it's just society just can't absorb it.
Was it far out? Because when I was young, to my teachers, they said in the late 20s, and there were different drugs and there were different scenes, but they had how would you say, an alternative life, in the 20s. And then in the late last century, they were using all kinds of stuff that were sold over the counter that were clearly opium-related.
Absinthe, of course. Yes. Luke, you're absolutely right. And one of Tim and I used to have endless conversations about other countercultures. We knew the 60s wasn't the first counterculture. And, the countercultures go all the way back historically. I mean, Jesus and his disciples were possibly a mushroom counterculture, in the Middle East.
Something bread-related, LSD, like ergot.
The Eleusinian mystery rites were... used an LSD-like substance. Albert Hoffman and Gordon Watson proved this about 20 years ago. This is a revolutionary discovery.
But that illusion, which was a rite that were, for a long time, say the richer and the more educated people from Greece and the Roman Empire, I think it lasted 800 years.
I heard it lasted about 2,000 years, and not only the wealthy, but even the common people were once a year partook in the Eleusinian mystery rites and sipped a beverage called Kikion, which was almost definitely a psychedelic drink. Based on LSD, and that's the cradle of Western civilization right there. But then in more modern times, there are the two periods that Tim and I used to really, enjoy discussing. The British Romantic poets, Coleridge and De Quincey and Byron and Shelley, who used opium extensively and wrote their poetry under the effects, and then the American transcendentalists. Tim, being from New England, Massachusetts specifically. Had a lot.
He liked to call himself an Irish.
Oh yes,
it's Irish heritage.
But Irish and Harvard and Thoreau and Emerson were heroes of his, and there was a lot of experimentation. It's not too well known with those people. And then Tim's estate, Millbrook, where he had the first psychedelic commune, was near where this guy lived, Fitzhugh Ludlow. And Fitzhugh Ludlow was the first American hashish eater and the first one to write about it in the English language decades before anybody else. And this was his book, The Hashish Eater. We put out an edition of this. This is the biography of Ludlow that's just been published, the first one. And Tim, we used to talk about Ludlow, Thoreau.
In fact, there's a historical line to history of people doing this, and probably if you go to the East where people eat datura, whatever, it's always been part of our culture. Yet it's denied. Why is that? Why is the inner experience, the realization that what goes on inside has an effect on what goes outside, and vice versa, that above is below, and all these mystical truths, always being repressed?
That's a great question. It could be. Could be answered in many different ways. I guess there's just the fear of an individual behavior, the fear of other people, the fear of what's inside people. So society, rules and regulations. Also, but perhaps more than anything, there's a freeing aspect ego freeing aspect in these kinds of experiences that would make people question authority.
And we can't have that.
That's right. And in fact, throughout, drugs have been both, they've been the source of the beginnings of many religions and culture and the heart of many cultures, but they've also been suppressed and huge penalties on their use at other times by other cultures. And now, in this huge hypocrisy, it's a $64 billion a year business. Some people say it's $1 trillion business on the planet, and it's vaster than almost anything, and yet laws against it and
it fills the prison and it keeps the legal system. Yeah,
and it's also a way of politically controlling people. As this happened in the 60s, it wasn't just marijuana smoking; it was marijuana smoking and anti-Vietnam War politics, that were linked together. And this seems to be now. It looks as if right now, as we sit here, it's tobacco smoking in California is very much frowned upon, and laws are going into effect limiting its use. And we laugh when we realize that 20 years ago or 30 years ago, when we went on the fire escape to smoke a marijuana cigarette, it could be that in another 5 or 10 years we'll be smoking the tobacco on the fire escape and the marijuana in our living rooms.
And let's be fair, 50 years ago, alcohol was forbidden. Prohibited.
The prohibition, that's a great example, how prohibition doesn't work, never work, can't work. But everybody knows these things, including the people running the so-called drug war. Everything is kind of a lie. And it's just politics and control, and things will change in due course. And someday there'll be something beyond psychedelics. I mean, in a sense,
we have things. We have Prozac. We have drugs that we don't call psychedelics, but they have an effect on the mind.
Right. But exactly. But I was thinking more about the electronics and the computer. Tim said computers were the LSD of the 90s, and
there was a discussion in. I was very much part of that New Age movement where computers and New Age were linked, where Barlow and Leary and Are You Serious and the Mondo people said that the New Age defied computers. They said technology is not. We have to go back to the green days and
yes,
stuff.
yes.
And then there was this group of people around Mondo here in Berkeley, and we said no. There must be a link. We must use the computer to overcome all the problems.
Yes.
Virtual reality happened then in 88, 89. Eric Gullickson. I had my first meeting with Leary while we were testing VR equipment at his house, and I put a helmet on and I came out of it and I looked at a painting at his house and I thought, gee, this is tridimensional, because I came out of it.
As if you were on acid.
Almost, and I immediately saw the link why Tim got so fascinated with this virtual reality thing.
The email is almost, compared to regular mail, everyone kind of really gets, it's a turn on, and it's a way of linking mind to mind. I think the best experience in psychedelics is like linking up with nature, feeling one with nature, but also feeling one with and linking up with people. And of course MDMA, ecstasy, the drug of the 80s and 90s, links people up emotionally, and then computers and electronics do this. Of course the telephone did this a long time ago,
and of course the industry at that time really was against it. Gerald Lanier, who claimed never to have used anything, he claims he've never used it, but he is wild and out there and a musician or whatever. So whatever, he must have some contact with the other world. But he used to say, no, this is not an electronic drug, virtual reality. And he didn't want that because he had a company and Intel and IBM.
He wanted it to be linked. I mean, and for, he probably was...
Everybody who tried it told me, well, the first thing he would do is go and buy, if they had the equipment, take some acid, go in the back room and see what's happening.
I mean, a lot of scientific breakthroughs. Kelly Mullis, who did Nobel Prize-winning work in genetics, said that LSD triggered his insight. That led to a Nobel Prize, and I think people will more and more come out with that sort of thing, and eventually, there'll be more acceptance. But by then, of course, society will have moved on, and there may be other drugs or other experiences that are available that make psychedelics outmoded. We know that everything changes. But there is something in psychedelics that has a tremendous rich history and legacy. I like to see drug literature, reprinted and recognized, and a lot of it is. This is a taboo. It's really, the history of drugs is like the secret history of mankind, and even now it's like the underground of the planet's economy, and it's the wild card, but it's a taboo subject still, and I mean there's. I'd like to, I try to bring it out into the open a little more by selling, by finding, discovering, making available to people in new editions, books from the past, and
because we just spoke about the virtual reality movement, that's the computer and psychedelics. You have a book about what we could say the feminist side of things. Which is also a whole thing of this century, of course.
Women have been neglected as writers. I mean, women have been connected to plants, sacred plants, and drug
Shaman Woman, Mainline Lady, women's writings on the drug experience.
It came out in 1982. It's going to be reprinted this year by Inner Traditions, and there's. Hopefully it's going to come out it's had a German edition that's coming out also in Spain and in Greece, which is nice. The writings of women, many famous women, George Sand, Louisa May Alcott,
Edith Piaf,
Charlotte Bronte.
Piaf, I see. Maria Sabina was the mushroom lady. Anita Hoffman,
Sarah Bernhardt, Elizabeth Barrett Browning. Many celebrated women have experimented with
Laura Huxley, of course, the wife, and Anais Nin, Yes, and these people all have admitted that they used it, and it was an inspiration.
And wrote about it very eloquently, and plus the mainliners, the women who experienced hard drugs, and there's a vast literature of this, and we, from the Leather Library, we put it all together, and we found we had a full-length book about it. In fact, we're updating it for the 80s and 90s, getting the women's point of view out there, and also pointing out that there's a very interesting connection, with going back to the Garden of Eden, Eve, the serpent and the apple, the first forbidden plant, the first drug bust, was the bust of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. And the apple was some kind of mushroom, no doubt. And there was the woman who, listened to the serpent and try the apple first. And the man was worried and afraid. So there's a very interesting connection. And most of the art of opium and hashish is a man falling asleep in a reverie with a pipe. He's just smoked. And a naked woman is coming in the smoke, coming out of the pipe. This is the key image in drug art for the 19th and early 20th centuries. So there's a sexual connection. There's an erotic, drugs as erotic tools is very important. Oddly enough, we always thought the sexual revolution would be the final one, but it looks like the sexual revolution has happened. And look what's happening with in the White House. I mean, it's the greatest wish of all of us that they'd only found a joint. That Clinton only used a marijuana cigarette and not a cigar with Monica Lewinsky, and that would be the ultimate in terms of...
And everything would be exposed.
But at any rate, sex is out in the open, all forms of sexuality and sexual frontier. But drugs are still, though vastly used. Knowledge about it is suppressed. So one of our goals was to get a book like this into print. And this is a book we did earlier, Huxley's Writings on Psychedelics. This is also Moksha.
This is what I remember is the Doors of Perception.
Doors of Perception is the first book on psychedelic literature, the book that inaugurated psychedelic literature, and the most important book still, perhaps, one of the most important. By the way, I want to give credit to my wife, Cynthia Palmer, who did both these books with me, and also was a director of the Ludlow Library as well. And Cynthia, in fact, was a guiding force behind the Shaman Woman book when we realized that none of the writings by women had been brought out.
Okay, so we had the hackers, and we have the feminists. There's another group, and that is the black people. Very few books have been written about the drug experience with black people or by black people. But, except that lately we find out that in Brazil, the ayahuasca churches are in fact a very strong indication that psychedelics have been part of that tradition.
Well, if we're talking about indigenous people, native people, third world people, true, there aren't a lot of books. Anthropologists, books weren't their medium. The jazz musicians, books weren't their medium. They had an enormous influence, black musicians in the 20s and 30s. There's so many songs about, dreamed about a reefer 5 feet long. They influenced the beats enormously, and but they didn't particularly write about it, just as the third world peoples haven't. But generally, it's anthropologists or sociologists who come in later and written about the counterculture, the fact that jazz really comes out of that culture, and that's probably one of the most authentic American contributions to the 20th century. We have found though that there were some. There were a lot of white people who kind of were actually, to be a drug user was to be like a black person. For a white person to take drugs, was like to go into the underworld, the underside of things.
Yeah, but that's where the Yahoo papers and whatever the William Burroughs, he was outcast, a nobody with the blacks.
Yeah, it's true. It was. The black counterculture is like really important and had a tremendous influence, but there wasn't so much literary materials that emerged from that. Although actually, Maya Angelou is in our new book because she wrote very eloquently about marijuana experience in her autobiographies. There are a lot of black women writers today who are among our best American writers, and they have not ignored some of that in their past. Mm-hmm.
The latest wave of psychedelics, as I mentioned, is not only the designer drugs that come from Shugin and others, but the ayahuasca, the yahe, the DMT containing plants or even animals that come from South America. There is some African drugs.
Yes, Iboga is another one. Yeah. Ibogaine for own addiction is another. Yeah. There are over 400 known psychoactive drugs in the New World. fewer in the old world, but altogether at least 500. There are 27,000 plant species, at least 500 are psychoactive. There's probably a few thousand more that are. Discoveries and rediscoveries are being made all the time. And there's, it's just really interesting that these plants could be found, and they're used always by the indigenous native peoples. Peyote in this country, which were suppressed for about 100 years, and now finally being usable by Native Americans, members of the Peyote Church.
Much more cacti that are psychedelic.
There are many others, yes.
Yeah, San Pedro, but according to Shugin, hundreds and hundreds of cacti have.
It's phenomenal. And also, there are hundreds of analogs of the amphetamine psychedelics, as Sasha Shulgin pointed out, that can be created. It's such a vast thing. One wonders, Terence McKenna's theory about, the mushroom spores, the planet being seeded,
coming from out of space.
That a cosmological theory might be that a higher intelligence, that where our planet is a laboratory experiment, from some high advanced civilization, and one of the things they did was when they visited this planet to just drop a couple of seeds, maybe 500 or a couple of thousand, and it's
spores of mushroom
spores, and perhaps the marijuana plant is a weed, for God's sakes. The opium poppy is a beautiful ornamental poppy. There's phenomenal. These plants are phenomenal, and then now you have chemists who extracted, Albert Hoffman preeminently, and now Sasha Shulgin, who've extracted the active agents. What chemistry could do. But then you also have the labs that, Prozac isn't that different than MDMA in some ways, serotonin uptake drugs. It's, what should happen is that, that research should be going on, legally, and, money should be put into research into these, various plants. And
what I find astonishing is that some of the things that they find out, take Viagra, a sexual stimulating drug, comes out and becomes a product and becomes a $1 billion business overnight. That's it. While some of the other drugs that might have similar things, and we have, of course, had the smart drugs, wave, mind-enhancing drugs 5 years ago, you don't hear anything about it anymore.
The psychiatric...
they protect their business.
They protect their business. I'm trying to find a word here. The psychiatric establishment since the 50s, with the tranquilizers and downers and uppers and so on, have just a stranglehold because of the vast profits the drug companies make on their own products, which generally they like to take the fun out of the substance. They have come up with some great things, no question about it, and they've helped people enormously. But the idea is to take the fun out of it, like THC, get the THC out of it, and just use what helps people overcome the nausea, perhaps in marijuana. But give them something that's legal that they pay for to feel better.
Legal and dull.
Yeah, legal and dull. So I think that's the reason for the, and also I understand you can't make money on certain things that are in the public domain like MDMA, so there's no money involved, and there's $90 million to get a new drug on the market. They have a stranglehold on it, and it isn't that they haven't come up with some great drugs that help people, but it could be so much better than that. There's so many more things out there, and they people are arrested who are trying to do research.
Let's come back to the book business, because you have an idea what's being written, what's out there now. In the late 50s, we had Aldous Huxley. He wrote Perennial Wisdom, which I immensely enjoyed, and Doors of Perception, some other books. We had writers in those days that were inspiring. When I now pick up a book, part of it is very much factual. Even Shugin's books have that, lots of fact. But then he adds lots of chapters about his experience. But I'm not feeling this inspirational kind of books. I don't see them.
Well, actually, Luke, there has been a renaissance in psychedelic books. There are over 200 in print in the U.S. right now, and there are a lot of new books. You almost have to know the author to get a copy and learn about its publication. Dale Penden's book, pharmacopoeia is an absolutely revolutionary new look at drugs and drug experience from any angle. A book called On Drugs by David Lentz, and a college professor, talks about drug experience from the inside. Jonathan Ott has written a series of wonderful books.
Yeah, but his books are so factual, so it's like
yes,
encyclopedic.
perhaps, but he has
Christian
some-
Rage, the German guy, just came out with a beautiful book.
Christian Rage. Well, Christian,
but there are
encyclopedia type of
Yeah.
books. Jonathan
you gotta back
is
the
a little didactic, but he talks very eloquently about the entheogenic reformation. There's the spiritual side of things. There's a number of people who, Wasson started, was one of the earliest, once changed the word psychedelic to entheogenic, God within, from mind manifesting to God within. And an entheogen is a Greek term for that, and they that's a kind of a more spiritual approach. I think the ayahuasca sessions have a spiritual approach. In fact, most of the native indigenous
The shamanic uses are
spiritual, and shamanism is a huge movement in this country. Of course, one of the secrets of shamanism is psychedelic plants, and sometimes that's not mentioned. But there are a lot of magazines and a lot of talk, and shaman is now almost a au courant word in our language. So I think the spiritual side is being addressed. And that's kind of a safer way of bringing it to people as well. But I don't think it's being ignored. But then there's also the rave. But the rave has been described as a spiritual event, and it is.
it's just a different age group.
Yes.
In Germany, the people who, at once we were at a big conference in Heidelberg, and there was this tendency by the professors of this and that to say, yeah, but give us. They wanted to do experiments with psychedelics in their psychiatric practices and in hospitals, and to give drugs to the kids, that's not good. And then the kids stood up, and some people really made a point that they have a right to have their own rituals, and their rave is their ritual.
Right. The rave is like a late 80s, 90s event, harking back to the 60s. As a kind of a product of the 60s, I came of age in the 60s and was part of that movement. I see the 90s really, our legacy is the 90s and the youth of the 90s. And the rave event is just like the psychedelic rock shows. I mean, not just like, I shouldn't, there are differences, but the point of it is, it's a kind of a shamanistic, humanistic party with very strong spiritual overtones. But the idea is ecstasy, getting out of yourself, empathy with others, linking up with other minds, and then using music, using dance, using trance.
Lifting the separation, basically. That's what it's.
Breaking down this boundaries and separation, and there really haven't been too many casualties. And when there are, or when there's a danger of it, there's a lot of information called the harm reduction movement. I've seen, and there's a lot of information on how to do this safely, which we could have used in the 60s. But frankly, as Tim used to like to say, there's more violence and injury any Saturday night in any large American city from alcohol than in the entire 1960s from psychedelic drugs. I mean, the proportions of these. Of course, there shouldn't be any danger to psychedelic drugs, and yet it's really rather slight compared to like alcohol, for example, or the dangers of tobacco smoking. Yeah.
What do you expect for the next millennium, the next 100 years?
Well, in a way, we have to get through the next year.
We have to make it.
It's like I can't wait till the millennium. Tim, I don't know if he coined the phrase, but there was a button that was given out at his lectures called Millennium Madness back in the early 90s. I mean, naturally he caught the early wave of this. And Terence McKenna has written very eloquently, and he's another writer who has to be mentioned. His books are really important. The madness began. I think those of us, who kind of came out of the 60s, and chaos is a term that comes to mind, and that Tim fell in love with the concept of chaos towards the end of his life. We're in, chaos is easier to handle if you've, maybe taken LSD at a rock concert, or a Grateful Dead concert, or taken ecstasy at a rave. There's I think there's going to be, there's going to be a lot of freaking out. It's going to be a wild ride through the millennium. And then once we get to the other side of it, it's like, I just look for it. I can't wait to see what happens in the 21st century, because we're going to be like the 19th century is to us. And you remember the 1890s were a wild time. I'm not, one to predict, but one thing I'd like to see is that we, through electronic technology, and with first of all, drugs that are precise. Sasha talked about developing a drug that you can take to a concert that lasts for 2 hours and you can appreciate music more. 2CB is a drug that does make music a little more vibrant and expressive, and you hear it better. The reason the Grateful Dead are so loved is, when you're on acid and listening to their music, it's 1,000 times better.
If you're not, it's kind of
not, yeah, But the fact is that they knew all that and they delivered, they performed and became that was a great spiritual movement, and the Deadheads. But anyway, there's I think drugs will probably be more precise. Drugs that do specific things for a shorter amount of time, perhaps, and that are easier on the body. So if chemists are allowed to work, they'll do it one way or another. There'll probably be new sacred plants discovered. This is the optimistic thing, and then it may be drugs that allow us to connect or compute, again, electronic computers, link up our minds. The internet is almost a metaphor for a group experience of the 60s. Anything that I think there'll be a lot of things that come along that make life better and make us it's just the tip of the iceberg, what we know and what we could experience. And then there'll be drugs at zero gravity, or zero gravity might be a drug that may be more virtual reality. We were hoping.
Still might happen.
But still might happen. So there'll be some merger of electronics, and drugs are in a way electronic. It's kind of molecular and kind of in a way we are also drugs for each other. The human being is like
there are fields there are auras, there are things
and so on, and we'll be able to penetrate those a little better, and it'll be.
Still a wide horizon out there.
Body expansion, and hopefully it'll be, there won't be too many casualties along the way. There won't be too much repression, and there'll also be just a general raising of the quality of life, and everyone will have an opportunity for this. But on the other hand, we'll have to see whether human beings can handle these new energies, whether they can ride the chaos, and whether whether there has to be more suppression, or whether there can be a new humanism in the 21st century that links people together and raises quality of life everywhere.
Okay, this one's Michael Horowitz about the psychedelic historian, about his experience with Tim Leary, and about how fun it all was and might be.
Let's not forget how much fun it all was. And that's important.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Luke.